one of the favorite quotes that I had, and there's a number of them in the chapter on change that I really enjoyed writing about. I think Malcolm Forbes had a great quote that I spun into change when he said, "If you don't budge, don't expect a push." Short amount of words and a lot of punch to it, so to speak. Bill Gates had a great one when he talked about success being a lousy teacher. He said it that way. He said success is a lousy teacher because it seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose.
Tom Hagerty has written a book, The Business of Relationships. It's a business oriented book, but it's really a breakdown of how we treat ourselves and others and what's truly important in our relationships. He touches on topics such as integrity, resilience, and honesty, and he does it using stories and quotes from business leaders. This is an inspiring book, and so is the conversation. Come join us. Tom, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Pat, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope to serve your audience well. I'm sure with your guidance and your questions, we will produce something of value to all of your listeners. But my personal journey, if you will, is for one, I'm 71 years old. I'm retired at the moment. I don't know if that'll be permanent or not. I can tend to get bored pretty quickly. But uh, I am the oldest of 10 children. I am married and divorced late in life and have four grandchildren. And life has been a series of bumps in the road for me, both professionally and personally. Obviously, on the personal side, a late in life divorce is never something that one would wish upon oneself. Um, and I certainly didn't anticipate it, but it came and I'm working through it. And it's been several years now. And each day gets a little bit better and a little bit different, which is the essence of living. I think on the professional side, I have been an intrapreneur slash entrepreneur for most of my career, which spans, over 45 years. And in a situation like that, as you well know from being self-employed, you can either be overemployed or underemployed, depending on the week or the month. And probably the biggest bump in the road for me professionally was in the early 2000s, founding a company that we wanted to make into the match.com of advertising. I came out of the advertising and marketing industry and looked at the internet as a way to marry creative people with those in need of their talents. And we got some funding from angel investors and private investors. We had a Series A round. The company didn't work, and it was my idea. Every word of that business plan was mine. Every hire was mine. Every concept that came about, every speech that was given. We were a young company, and it was my show. And when something like that craters, not only do you disappoint your investors, but the biggest disappointment was to me, and it took a while to recover. So that situation is clearly the one bump in the road that I would say shook the car to its foundation when I hit that bump.
In retrospect, I mean, Fiverr's up and running now, probably came along a bit later. In retrospect, what do you think you missed in your business plan?
I think, as some people said, we were at the right bus stop at the wrong time. There just wasn't the traction. We also hit the financial meltdown so that the money dried up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Some of the commitments we had went away, and everybody was just trying to survive that 2008, 2009, 2010, um, you know, cataclysm that we all went through. So I think that's probably what we missed. I think today I still get people once in a great while who are aware of it say, you ought to rejuvenate that. You ought to do this. Well, as you said, Fiverr is out there and a bunch of other imitators like it. And if you're going to sell your wares to do somebody's sell sheet or brochure for 25 bucks, have at it. That
Yeah.
is not the direction we were going. And so, yeah, I think it's just an opportunity missed. But like I said, we were at the right bus stop, just the wrong time.
Bumps like that really make you stop and reflect. They're very difficult. And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about your book because I think your book is so valuable, particularly for anybody in business, because we all hit these business bumps that can just shatter us. And there's wisdom out there. Talk about your book, how the idea came about, and give us a little bit, give the audience a little bit of a sense of how the book is laid out.
Okay, sure, sure. Well, the first thing I would say about the book is that it is a book that was never intended to be a book. Uh, it started out as a series of essays that I wrote to my kids. They were growing up and out of the house and making their way in their first, second, or third careers, and it was a way for me to express in words some pretty timeless wisdom. And I came across these quotes in magazine articles, in shareholder reports, in interviews on TV or radio. And it became easy for me, Pat, to look at a quote and say, this is clearly in a business context. This was given in a speech, or this was given in a shareholder letter to investors. If you spun it a little bit, could it apply to some quality of a personal relationship? And after I had written a number of these, one of my kids and several of my friends who had seen it said, "Hey, this ought to be a newspaper column." And I poo-pooed that idea and finally sat down with a friend of mine who writes for the business press as part of a national conglomerate of business weeklies. You may have one in Idaho. We certainly have one in Cincinnati. And he loved what I showed him and said, "With your permission, I'd like to pitch this to my editors." Several weeks later, the editors came back and said, "Man, we love these things, but the problem is we're not an op-ed newspaper. We're a business fact-based weekly publication reporting on current events, if you will, in the business world." Um, but they said, "Tell your friend this could be a book if he had enough of them." And I didn't like that idea either because it was more work and it was more public exposure, if you will. But I don't know how it transpired, but I finally sent it off at his request to some publishers that he gave me, as well as a few that I developed on my own. And lo and behold, one of them got back to me and said, "Man, we really like this. When will you have the rest of it?" And therein went the deadline. And foolishly I said, "Well, I think I could have it completed in 3 months." And I ended up meeting the deadline for the manuscript, but it was certainly a very circuitous journey. And as far as the layout is concerned, Pat, what I started to do when I got serious about this, when it looked like it was going to be a book or somebody wanted it to be a book, I said, "Well, you better do a lot more homework about the qualities that are essential in personal relationships." And that's where the 12 qualities that are in the book came from. It was just a lot of research, everything from the Harvard Business Review to the Northwestern School of Medicine's journal. Marriage.com was in the mix. NBC News and ABC News was in the mix. It was just me grabbing anything I could about relationships and about essential qualities of personal relationships. And I gravitated to those 12 because they seemed to be the ones that were most mentioned most frequently. Not every publication or every outlet had them all 12, but there was enough similarity that I said I'm pretty comfortable with these. And so you have things in there, as you know, like perspective and trust and integrity and honesty. You have a sense of risk and a sense of change. You have resilience and humility and priority and commitment. Probably didn't name all 12 of them, but I could keep going. But those are the kind of 12, and then it became, I would say, somewhat of an art to say, of all these quotes that I have, can I spin one in the direction of commitment, or several in the direction of resilience, or a few
Hmm.
more in the direction of perspective? So um, that's how it came to be, and I felt very comfortable with it. I think the probably the thing I would do over a little bit would be the very first chapter, because I tried to look at relationships in general. That's in
Hmm.
fact the title of the first chapter, and I wanted to look at, what do the major religions say about relationships? What do the major schools of psychology and philosophy say about relationships? What do more recent pundits and athletes and musicians and a variety of people say about relationships? And I think that first chapter was a bit long in my words, but when I've raised that topic with other people on a podcast or a radio interview, they very quickly say, "Oh, no, 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 no! I love the first chapter. I love the way it's set
I,
up and
I
all."
did
So
too. I really like the fact that you really looked at the entire world, different types of philosophies, different types of religions, different approaches to life and relationships, because not only are they all valid, but a lot of them say the same things.
yes, yes. I mean, it absolutely amazed me how much similarity there is when you look at something that is as ancient as say Hinduism and Buddhism, all the way forward to the most recent major religion that we have, which is the Islam, faith. So I think there was so much there that when you pull things out of their scriptures, out of their holy books, if you will, how very, very similar that thought was about the primacy of good, solid personal relationships.
I'm going on the fifth year of this podcast, and I totally agree with what you found because the thing that I have found is that regardless of where somebody is in life or what their particular bump is, people share similar experiences. And that's because they're emotional. If you've ever felt isolation, you can relate to somebody with isolation. If you've ever felt loss, you can relate to somebody with loss. And I think the same goes for relationships in general and in business. One of your chapters on perspective, you mentioned Steve Jobs. Do you remember what you wrote about Steve Jobs?
I do. I do. That was one of my favorites, and it might have been the first such quote that I ever wrote about and shipped off to my children at the time. So, but Steve Jobs said that remembering I'll be dead soon is one of the biggest tools I use to make major decisions. And he said this in that famous 2005 speech to the Stanford graduates,
Yeah.
which is something I like to watch about once a year just because it's so full of wisdom. You
Mhm.
can get it up on YouTube anytime you feel like it, and it's a 45 minutes well spent. But I looked at that and said, what a perspective to have in your life as you look at the long term of a relationship. You look at the span of a relationship, and you say that, you know, remembering that I'll be dead soon tells me that this is something that we all share, that we all have a sense of urgency, but yet we step back from that urgency a bit to say, I'm doing things now for the long-term benefit of this relationship. That's the way I interpreted that quote, was that it's certainly conveying a sense of urgency, but also a sense of the long-term value of a relationship when you characterize it as such.
I think it also motivates you to be present in the relationship, don't you think?
I do, absolutely. I mean, when Jobs gave that quote, if you remember that speech in
Yeah.
2005, he was post cancer at that time. He had been cured. He references that in the speech. So he thought everything is clear sailing from here on out. I'm grateful to be here, grateful to be in front of you, and grateful to be cured. And who knew that a short, half decade later, he'd pass away from a different, situation with cancer. But yeah, I think it does demand presence and you know just being in the relationship in the now and not I think the recovery community has a good line. They talk about if you have one foot in the past and one foot in the future, you'll end up pissing on the present. Sorry, sorry about the profanity or a bit of it, but I think that we so often get caught up in our fears of the future and our resentments in the past that we can't engage with each other and live with each other in the present moment. And literally, that's all we have. That's all of us has.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the present moment and stopping and learning to foster being present in the present moment is so important because it's where our creativity comes from. It's where now comes from. It's where we live. And if you're living in the past or the future, you're not experiencing this moment. And what a waste
No,
that is.
it
You could
is.
spend a
It is.
lifetime not experiencing this moment.
Absolutely can. And many people do. I mean, many of
Yeah.
us live in the resentments, and we're convinced that everyone is thinking about us, talking about us, laughing at us, et cetera, et cetera, when in reality, you're the furthest thing from their mind. I hate to disabuse people, and but we are not the most important people in most other people's lives. And I think Mark Manson, had a very good observation in his book, the Subtle Art book that we all know. Um, and he said the uncomfortable truth is not only will you and everyone you know die, but the people in your life will only remember what you did and what you said for a very short period of time after you're gone. And I think that's a real reality check for a lot of people because we would all like to believe we're the most important player on the stage, and we're not.
Now, you know what I find interesting though? Many of us who are out on, have a social media presence of some sort, particularly on, say, YouTube or a website or a Substack, actually, our words will live beyond us
Mhm.
and have a presence. And I find that kind of interesting. I don't know where it's going to lead, but we do live on in an electronic world.
I wonder sometimes if even that is a bit overblown because when we're gone, the site may still exist or the blog post that we had may still exist, but how many people are going to encounter it? Uh, some of us would be gratified if 50 people a day encountered it when we were alive.
No, very true. Very true.
So,
You have chapters on both honesty and integrity. How do they differ?
well, honesty, I think, is outward. It is a quality that you are demonstrating in your dealings with other people, that you are an honest person, that you are forthright, that you say what you mean and mean what you say, if you will. I think integrity is one of those things that that's when the door closes at night and there's nobody around, and it's fundamental to your nature that you do certain things, believe certain things, act in certain ways when nobody's looking. That to me is the difference between the two. One is very outward and one is maybe more inward.
That's interesting. I think integrity is incredibly important because, boy, if you're just not a person of integrity, at some point that's going to bite you in your life.
I would agree. I would agree. I mean, it catches up with most of us. I won't say all of us because there seem to be some people that have Teflon around them that it doesn't catch up to them, or they've created such a culture of fear that people are afraid to challenge anything. But no, I think it for most of us, a lack of integrity will catch up, and it will cost you in terms of the vibrancy and longevity of your relationships.
Yeah. Change is one of my favorite topics because I believe that if we can learn to enjoy change and find a curiosity, find it interesting, our lives will be so much easier because if we resist change and we insist on staying in our comfort zone, we will face cataclysmic change at some point if we refuse to evolve. And cataclysmic change is much harder than incremental change.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I mean, the one of the favorite quotes that I had, and there's a number of them in the chapter on change that I really enjoyed writing about. I think Malcolm Forbes had a great quote that I spun into change when he said, "If you don't budge, don't expect a push." Short amount of words and a lot of punch to it, so to speak. Um, Bill Gates had a great one when he talked about success being a lousy teacher. He said it that way. He said success is a lousy teacher because it seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose.
Oh boy.
And and that was a quote from one of his shareholder letters. It's clearly said in a business context. It was clearly said in the relationship that Microsoft had in fostering change and in taking the gloves off, so to speak, with certain initiatives and having that be a company value. And like I said, I just thought it was too good to pass up when you look at change. Um, and it was just a lot of fun to write about. But those kind of things, you hit the nail on the head. Incremental change is what a lot of people talk about, and the value of it is clear. But we tend to wait until disaster is at the door before we say, well, now I better pivot. Now I better change. Now I better reconstruct myself. Now I better go into rehab. Now I better quit being financially irresponsible. When the paycheck doesn't cover the expense anymore, well, now I got to do something about it. And it's just so hard, and there's so much anxiety and in many cases depression and other physical and mental ailments that come of it because we don't pay attention to just doing the simple things well and doing them in advance of catastrophe.
No, but it's human nature. People want to stay in their comfort zone, and people will fight to stay in their comfort zone rather than change. And, some of us are a little more comfortable with change. Some people are very uncomfortable with it. And for those that are uncomfortable with it, I think sometimes they can actually stay in that safe little foxhole that they've created. But I think they're missing the point of life. I think they're missing the experience and the personal evolution that goes with change.
I think you miss out on the mystery of life, that things are to be discovered, things are to be explored. When I think back to my own father, for instance, he was a man who fought in two wars. He went to World War II. He was a tank commander. He got home. He was a business guy for a couple of years, and the government said, "No, we got this problem in Korea. We need guys like you. Come on back." And they brought him back, and I often wonder if I had had the opportunity, because he was like a lot of veterans of that era. They did their job, they came home, they made families, they were imperfect uh, people, but they made things work. And they did it because they were able to embrace that kind of change, if you will, or grow beyond themselves. I mean, can you imagine being a kid from small town Cincinnati, Ohio, who goes to France and gets wound up in Patton's army and goes through France and into Germany and sees the war end, and then go to this hellish place called Korea, a scant few years later, and come back reasonably normal. And I think that our generation, and you know, don't mind this characterization at all. I think a lot of us have gotten very soft when we talk about the changes that we could make in our lives. Um, we think it's so monumental, and you look back in the rearview mirror a little bit at the previous generations and say, I don't think the changes that are being demanded of us are exactly on a par with the changes that my dad or your dad or grandfathers, great grandparents faced. We live in a pretty soft time right now, and we
We,
have it
we,
pretty
we
good.
really do. I mean, you look at the men who fought in World War II. My father was one. He was with the 8th Army Air Force. And that experience changed their lives on multiple levels. They never really talked, most of them never really talked about the emotional aspect of the experience, but it sent the majority of those men off on a tangent they never would have expected. They received first class education that most of them probably wouldn't have had access to. I mean, the world changed enormously, and there were very good things that came about as a result of that post World War II era.
I agree. I agree 100%. And I think while I could be characterized as having an idyllic childhood. I'm the oldest of 10 children. 9 of us are still surviving. Most of us still live in the Cincinnati area, if you will, within 50 miles of each other. And it wasn't a perfect childhood, Pat, but it was one that uh, there was some certainty about it. And you grew up in a neighborhood, you had friends, you played until dark. Your parents didn't wonder where you were when your bike was missing and you were gone somewhere. It was just a different time, and it wasn't perfect. I don't couch it that way. I think the World War II generation probably visited a few things emotionally and psychologically on the descendants that wouldn't be looked at as appropriate today. But at the same time, on balance, it was a pretty good time to be an American, I think,
Well,
in the
there was an
60s.
assumption of safety that we don't seem to have anymore. You know, it's when we grew up around the same time, and you would go ride your bike. You'd come home when it was dark. You'd come home for dinner and go back out again. Nobody worried about where you were or what you were doing in most cases. And today, I don't think you could do that.
No, no. I know that when my wife and I were married and raising our children, uh, we lived in a very safe, very secure, nice neighborhood. I was on the community council. She worked at the school and as a volunteer. But still, when you looked out that dining room window and you didn't see your daughter, and she's 8 years old, and you immediately say, "Uh-oh, a white van." A guy offering, all the horror stories that we all know, and it never came true, thankfully. But at the same time, our parents, I don't think ever even entertained that kind of a thought. It's, oh, Tom's bike's missing. He's probably out with Reed and Jimmy, and he knows what time lunch is,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's when he'll be home.
That leads to risk. I mean, we didn't wear bicycle helmets. It was just such a different time. But you have a chapter on risk. Talk to me about risk because you obviously have a little bit of a risk taker, or maybe a lot of a risk taker in you, given the fact that you went the startup route at one point.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think the essence of risk is I would say a lack of attachment to the comfort zone. That you are able to wisely risk because you assess the situation or the opportunity or the challenge, if you will. You're assessing all of those things and hopefully doing so with an eye to uh, an appropriate risk, if you will, not something that's foolhardy, daring, dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. But I think risk is essential in a relationship, especially in the essays that I put into that chapter. it really talked about people who fundamentally say, I am willing to be at risk emotionally, psychologically, etc., because the value of the relationship that is enhanced by that wise risk is worth more than the potential vulnerability or the potential difficulty that I could encounter if this was used against me, if you will. You know, a lot of people uh, shelter themselves in their relationships, or they, in my mind, don't extend themselves because that fear of exposure or you know some kind of situation, if you will, where that would be used against them, that fear is so great that they don't take the risk. And I think that's in business and in life, that's just one of the areas that if you're not able to take wise risks, I think the relationship or the business or the idea or the education is not going to be what it could have been had you been a little more vulnerable and a little more willing.
Well, and in business, I think risk, actually, I'll say across your life, I think risk is part of what makes life interesting. Now, again, I'm not talking about doing anything totally foolhardy, maybe just partially foolhardy. But think of the good stories you have to tell.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. You have a chapter on commitment, and the first person in that chapter is Jeff Bezos, who just got remarried, as you know.
Yes, yes, yes.
But what
Well,
about,
and I think he talks about that in his quote, that the thing that he would regret is not if he had tried and failed, but if he hadn't tried at all. And you think about this story of Amazon, and I read a couple of books about Amazon in my time, and I think the best one was the Everything Store that literally gave the author unlimited access to executives. And what comes out of that story really is that here's this guy who's got a secure future in a bond house in New York, in the financial world, understands things, looks at the internet, says, hey, I got this goofy idea causes him to resign his position and write a business plan as he takes a cross country trip, and with a stop at his parents' house, who I guess he took some money from him, said, hey, I got this idea for a bookstore online and I think I can make it work. And uh, these people were rich by no means, but mortgaged part of their future to support him, and the rest is history. I mean, when he said, I think it was in the Everything Store, he said his biggest dream in the early years of Amazon was being able to afford a forklift because he said it was backbreaking work to put together those UPS packages every day with books and books and books and books. He said, I just wanted a forklift. So I think that's one of those things that you look at the evolution and continuing progress of Amazon, and um, you know some of the personal lives of any of the executives in the book are not ones that we would many times want to imitate. But when it comes to that sense of commitment that he had, it's just an unbelievable story about his unwavering faith in Amazon and building it the way he did.
and I think there's an element of faith in yourself, even when things are falling apart.
Yes, yeah, there has to be. There has to be. I mean, it is it is so hard to regulate our emotions. It is so hard to many times be resilient and bounce back from disappointment, but it's essential in the long term because you look at the alternative and say there really isn't one. What is the alternative? Shrinking away to nothing, isolating yourself, watching friendships dry up and go away, watching associations, watching passions, things that you used to care about dry up and go away. I mean, all of that happens when you just um, can't be resilient, for lack of a better term.
I think resilience is incredibly important, and I think that a large majority of people lack the kind of resilience that really allows them to navigate life's bumps. I think too many people just shy away when they're hurt or when they quote unquote lose, and they don't want to come out of that comfort zone again. And part of resilience is repetitively going outside your comfort zone, seeing what's out there, some good, some not so good, but taking wisdom from it. And if you don't do that, you're not growing as a person in terms of your experience and ultimately the wisdom that comes from it.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, Pat, if I can sidetrack a little bit into the
Yeah.
chapter of resilience, there was a lot of uh, emotion around that chapter for me because it was the capstone of the book. I mean, there's one chapter after that, which is some final thoughts, but resilience is really the capstone of things. And I think there's two quotes that come to mind. One is the quote from Sheryl Sandberg, and Sandberg was one of these people. I mean, she had a nice career in government in the Clinton administration. She had a nice career at Google. She had a nice career at Facebook. She got thrown under the bus during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and Zuckerberg blamed her personally for that. And then she loses her husband on vacation to a sudden death, and you think, here's a pretty good track record up to a point, and then the Facebook thing kind of comes apart for a while, and certainly the family thing comes apart when her husband passed away. And she said something really compelling to me. She said, each one of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think that kind of sentiment is essential to having resilience, that you have to be able to attach onto that. As hard as it is, you have to be able to somehow attach that I am more than this failed business. I am more than this failed marriage. I am more than this addiction. I am more than this irresponsibility. And it doesn't give you license to repeat the same things over and over again. But when she said that to me, Pat, it meant so much because she didn't say, well, the ones of us who pray the most, or the ones who give the most to our university that we went to, or the ones who are nicest in the church meeting. She said, no, each one of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. The other quote that I really liked, and she's sort of an electric personality now, but J.K. Rowling said that rock bottom was the firm foundation upon which she built her life. And you think of this person who's writing a manuscript longhand at night in her car, living with her kids because she's homeless, she's out of an abusive relationship, et cetera, et cetera. And wow, that is rock bottom. I mean, that's a bottom that most of us don't want to ever experience, even in passing. And yet she said, that is the firm foundation upon which I built my life. I think that's incredibly compelling. And I think each one of those quotes to me, just recalling both of them, each one of those quotes speaks to resilience in such a powerful way and gives us, I think, something to grab onto as well. Again, Sheryl Sandberg, we're more than the worst thing we've ever done. J.K. Rowling, you can build your life when you hit rock bottom. You can build it back. I think those are just extremely powerful sentiments that maybe people can attach to.
You offer 3 steps, if you will, to really incorporate all these principles. And you talk about, do you remember what those are?
The 3 steps? No, I
Yeah.
honestly don't. So why don't you refresh my memory?
Having written a book, I know I've forgotten certain things. So that's why I say that. But you said to commit to something, to be accountable, and stay positive and in the
Right,
present.
right. Yes, that was, I think, in the final chapter.
Yes.
Um, you know, and I think it's essential. Yes, I think, we talked a little bit before the show about staying in the present moment
Yeah.
and being accountable. I think you have to have people on the journey with you that are sharing in the wins and helping you through the losses and being accountable and just as we say oftentimes, doing life together. It's better together than it is alone. And I don't think successful lives in general are built by being alone.
On the topic of committing to something goes to goal setting. And I know sometimes I shy away from goal setting, but I've always been most successful when I set goals and I go for them. And I think commit to something is really important in the human realm, if you will, whether it's committing to the people who you employ, the people you work with, a spouse, your children. I think commitment is right up there with integrity.
I agree with that as well. And I was just going to go there with integrity, that I think the fundamental commitment, or the place that I start anyway, in my humble opinion, would be committing to myself, as you said, whether
Mhm.
that's through goal setting, whether it's benchmarking, whether it's being accountable and being transparent with people. I think that it's absolutely essential that we first and foremost commit to ourselves and our vision and how that vision can be played out for the benefit of the important others in our lives, our children, our grandchildren, our spouse, our best friends, our neighbors, business colleagues, if you will, if we're still in the working world. There are essential commitments to them that must be made and kept, but I think the primal relationship is really with ourselves in committing and keeping that commitment to ourselves.
So
Well, I'll,
what are your final words of wisdom?
I'll just say this, okay? Um, there's 5 words in the book. I think you would be challenged to find 5 more compelling words, not only in my book, but anywhere else. And that is change before you have to. That is a quote from Jack Welch, and I know exactly the context in which it was given. I worked at GE in the middle '80s under Jack. He was a lot of levels removed from me, but I did get to meet some of his lieutenants and was privileged to be there at the time that he was there. And that quote was actually given in a speech. And Jack was a tough guy. He didn't
Oh
mince
yeah.
words. And Jack Welch was giving a speech to all of his business leaders of the various units, GE Medical, GE Aerospace, GE Finance, et cetera, et cetera. And he said to them, if you are not number one or number two in your marketplace, I will fix you, close you, or sell you. So change before you have to. And that was almost a mantra back then. And I had a lot of fun writing it because I had some perspective on where it came from. But I also had, I guess, the fun of looking at it in a context of a relationship. And if Jack Welch were alive today and sitting next to me, he'd say, Hagerty, you're an idiot. I never meant it that way. But
Oh, he
but
sure
change
did.
before
He was a tough taskmaster.
but what he didn't do is what I did in that essay, and that is change before you have to, the financial irresponsibility. Change before you have to, the passive aggressive nature that's destroying the relationship with your kids. Change before you have to, the bad temper. Change before you have to, the budding addiction. And kind of guiding people in a direction of saying, yeah, this tough guy's business quote can be pretty instructive for us in our personal relationships as well. And change before you have to. So back to your earlier point about change and people's reluctance and resistance to it, I don't think there's 5 better words. Change before you have to. It's right there and it's in your face and it's direct and it's simple.